Hey guys, this is part 4 of our series on Spring Boot application. In this video, let us learn to handle exception for our REST API that we have created in the previous video. Let us jump into the application directly. In the previous video, while recording, I have made few mistakes. I missed to add path variable, and for the request param, the URL that I have given was wrong. I have already indicated in the video also. Now let me change it in the product controller directly. Here I missed to add at path variable annotation. For both the parameters, we need to add at path variable annotation. The next thing that I have missed was I have given request param. The parameter is request param, but the URL that I have provided here is for path variable. So let me change it. It should be product/color. Because we are using request param, add a question mark and add the query string after the question mark. The name of the query string should match the request param variable name. So here color equal to blue. This should be the URL. Okay. Now let us move on to the part of handling the exceptions that may occur in a REST API. When we talk about a REST API, what are the possible exceptions that may occur in any REST API, not specific to our application. In our application, we know we are handling product not exception, we are handling invalid ID exception. Other than that, what are the generic exceptions that may occur for all the REST APIs irrelevant of the domain model? Let us discuss on that. Number 1, assume you are having a REST API with a mapping as get mapping. So it means it accepts only the data that is coming from HTTP method get. From the client side, if you are trying to call the same method using post instead of get, then you will get an exception. HTTP request method not allowed. That is calling the REST API using a different HTTP method. So the exception that will be thrown is HTTP request method not allowed. Number 2. In case of post method, you need to send the data in the body part of the request. While sending the data in the body part of the request, you need to choose the appropriate media type. If you are not sending the appropriate media type to the REST API, then you will get an exception. Media type not supported exception. Say for example, your REST API is accepting the media type only as JSON. But if you are sending the data as text format, then you will get media type not supported exception. Number 3. You are supposed to send the value for a path variable. When you are sending the value for the path variable, if the path variable is missing, then you will get an exception as missing path variable exception. Number 4. You are trying to send the data using request param. In case, if the name in the query string does not match the name in the request param annotation, you will get an exception, missing request param exception. Number 5. Suppose your REST API is expecting a number, but you are passing a string. You all know it actually throws number format exception. In this case, they are giving the exception name as type mismatch. Internally, it will show you that the exception that has occurred is number format exception only. So these are the common exceptions that may occur in any REST API irrelevant of the domain model that we are using. So instead of we writing the code to handle these exceptions, Spring Framework has come up with an idea to handle these exceptions in an easier manner. Okay, how to handle exception in a Spring MVC application or Spring REST API? Whenever you want to handle an exception in a Spring REST API or in a Spring MVC application, you need to create a method that is annotated with @exception_handler. Let me give the method public. If you are having this as a Spring MVC application, the return type can be a string or model and view object. String handle what exception you want to handle. In our case, I want to handle product not found exception. So you can give the method name as handle product not found. In the exception handler also, you need to specify what exception you are handling. If you are handling more than one exception, then you can provide it as comma separated values. In my case, I want to handle only product not found exception. So I can give it as product not found exception dot class. For this method, you need to pass product not found exception as parameter. Inside this method, you can handle the exception. If this is an MVC application, you can return the name of the view page. Okay. This is for MVC. What is the case of Spring REST API? In case of Spring REST API also, if you want to handle the exception in a particular controller, within the controller itself, you can create a method that is annotated with @exception_handler. Pass on the exception that you want to handle. If I am having multiple controllers, say for example, product controller, admin controller and user controller. In case of product controller, I will create one method that will handle only product not found exception. In case of user controller, I will create one method that will handle only user not found exception. Same is the scenario for admin controller. What if I want to handle all the exception that occurs across all the controllers? In that case, you need to create a separate class that is annotated with @controller_advice. Okay, what is this exception handler? How does it look like? You all know that we have learned about try catch. What is the purpose of a try and catch? In a try block, you will add all the error prone statements. And whenever an exception occurs, automatically it will enter into the catch statement to handle the exception. Similarly, in case of any controller, whenever an exception occurs in the controller, it will check whether you have created a method in the same controller that is annotated with @exception_handler. So these exception handlers are similar to your catch statement. If it is not having the exception handler in the same controller class, it will go in search of a class that is annotated with @controller_advice. It will identify the appropriate exception handler and it will map the error message. In case of REST API, whenever we are writing a method, we will be returning a response entity object. So here also you can return a response entity object. Response entity of object. So this is how you handle an exception if it occurs within a particular controller. But what if I want to handle all these generic exceptions that may occur in any of the controllers? In that scenario, as I told, you need to create a class global exception handler which will handle all the exceptions that occur across all the controllers. This class should be annotated with @controller_advice. This is the same for both a Spring MVC application and REST API. In case of REST API, because we need to handle all these kind of exceptions, we don't have to rewrite the code again and again. We can extend our class by response entity exception handler. What is the purpose of this? This response entity exception handler is a class. It is handling all these exceptions by creating methods that is annotated with @exception_handler. So we don't have to rewrite the code again and again to handle these exceptions. We can use the existing handlers to handle these exceptions. So let us see how this can be done. So in the exceptions package, let us create a new class. The class name is global exception handler. Click finish. And this class should be annotated with @controller_advice. And because this is a REST API, as I told, this global exception handler should extend response entity exception handler. Let me click on this. This is our response entity exception handler class. Here you can notice they have created a method with the name handle exception, and this method is annotated with @exception_handler. Notice the number of exceptions that this particular method is handling. They have created one single method. From within the method, they are calling the other methods. You can see return handle request method not supported. So this is a separate method. Let me click on this. So here you can notice. What is the return type of these methods? If you notice here, the return type is a response entity object, because our REST API always returns a response entity object. When you are getting the data will be in the form of JSON. When you are giving a wrong input, The error message also will be thrown in the form of JSON. So this is a REST API which I am running now. You can notice the URL. Let me click send. Now instead of get, if I am using delete method, then I should get an exception. Here you can notice I am getting method not allowed exception and see the error message. The error message is also in the form of JSON format. It is giving the timestamp, that is when the exception has occurred, the status code, the error message and the path. So when you are handling these exceptions, when you want to give the exception message to the client, you need to have your own error object. The error object should have the appropriate details which are in the form of JSON. So for this purpose, we will be creating our own API error class which will have all these properties. When an exception occurs, we are going to give a user-friendly error message so that the other application that is calling the REST API can understand this. So to get an error message similar to the JSON given below, let us create a class with the name API errors in our model package. So select your package, right click, new class. The class name is API errors. Let us add the properties private, local, date time. This is to capture the date and time of the exception. And let me give the name as timestamp. Then next one is private int status code. So this has to give the status code as 200 or 500 internal server error or 201 created, something like that. Then the third property is private string error. This is to print the error message. This is the data that will be converted into a JSON object and given back to the client. And the next one is private HTTP status. This is a enum value. So for the status code that you have got, the appropriate enum value will look like OK, internal server error. The internal server error should not be sent back to the client as such. It should be handled and it should be given in a proper way. Internal server error, then created. I have given the enum value for the equivalent status code that is over here. Okay. And we need getter setter methods, toString, no args constructor, all args constructor. Let me add all that. Now our API errors class is ready. Let us go back to the global exception handler. Now within this class, let us override few methods of response entity exception handler. Whatever exception messages that we were discussing, that is method not allowed, media type not supported, type mismatch, missing request variable, missing path variable. So keep the cursor inside the class, go to source, override implement methods, media type not supported, then HTTP request method not supported, missing path variable, missing servlet request parameter, handle type mismatch. So you need to select 5 methods and click OK. These are the 5 methods. Handle HTTP request method not supported, handle HTTP media type not supported, handle missing path variable, handle missing servlet request parameter, handle type mismatch. And the appropriate exception is given as a parameter inside the method. In case of the first method, HTTP request method not supported, let me click on this. This is an exception which is extending servlet exception. And the message that we will be getting over here is request method post not supported, request method get not supported. This is the exception message. Now let us write the code for this method. If you notice, the return type is a response entity object. We need to create an API errors object with all the error details, wrap it around a response entity object and return it back to the client. Let us create the API errors object. API errors is equal to new API errors of, it expects local date time, status code, error message. Together with that, we need to pass the enum value of HTTP status. So let us do it one by one. For the first parameter, it is local date time dot now to capture the current time of the exception, comma. The second parameter is the status code. To get the status code in status code equal to status dot value. This will return the status code. So I can pass this as status code. The third parameter is the error message. To retrieve the error message, string error is equal to, we already have the exception object over here. So it is ex dot get message. Let me pass that. And the last parameter is the HTTP status object. HTTP status is equal to, I have got the status code. From the status code, I can get the HTTP status value. HTTP status dot value of by passing the status code. So we can pass the last parameter also. That is HTTP status. Now we have created our API errors object. Let us wrap it around the response entity and return it back to the client. Response entity dot status. It is expecting HTTP status code. Already we are having it, so we can pass the status directly. Dot headers. Already there is a headers object. If you want to add headers, you can add the headers also. So here I can give headers dot add info. Method not supported. Give your own error message, or you can pass ex dot get message directly. That also is fine. Headers dot body by passing the API errors object. So this is for the first method. Similar to this, let us do it for all the other methods also. I can copy paste the same code and I can modify it. So here also it is status code, the error message. In case of info, the message is media type not supported. And let me click on this exception. This is the error message that you will be getting for string error object. So this is for the second exception. Let me do it for the third one. For this, path variable is missing. Let me click on this missing path variable exception. And this is the message that you will be getting. And for the fourth one, missing servlet request parameter, pass it on, and the message is request param variable name does not match. Let me click on this exception, and this is the error message you will be getting. And for the last one, type mismatch. Type mismatch. If you notice, in all these cases, we have not created our own status code. The status is already provided by the exception. The header object is already available. So we don't have to create a separate header object. We can use the header object which is created already, and we are adding our own exception message. See, all these are fine. But what about our exception? In our application, we are having two exceptions. One is product not found exception. The other one is invalid ID exception. So for handling those two exceptions, it is our duty that we need to create two methods that is annotated with @exception handler to handle these two exceptions. So let us add the method. The method will look something like this. We cannot pass these parameters HTTP headers, HTTP status code and web request as parameter because Spring is providing them. In our case, we need to create it explicitly. Let us change the method. The method name is handle product not found. So this is the naming convention. If you notice, they are not adding the word exception to this method name. And the method name starts with handle. So I am following the same naming convention. The exception is product not found exception. No other parameter is required. And this method should be annotated with @exception handler, within which pass the exception that you want to handle. Product not found exception dot class. Now inside this, we need to get the status code. We need to provide the HTTP status value. We need to create our own error message and then create the API errors object. To start with, we need the status code. So let me give the status code as HTTP status. HTTP status is equal to HTTP status dot Let us use an appropriate status code. In this case, let us use no content. The next line, string error is equal to ex.getMessage. Guys, all this time I was assuming that the exception name is product not found exception. I have given the name as product not exception. Let me rename it. Just now I have noticed it. Refactor, rename it as product not found exception. So wherever we have used, it will be renamed. Click finish. Okay. In this case, the error message for this variable will be coming from the service implementation class. Let me open it. In service IMPL, if the category is not available, we are returning the error messages product with this category not available or product with this brand not available. This will be the error message that we will be getting. Then next is we need to create a HTTP headers object also. Headers is equal to new HTTP headers.add info ex.getMessage. The same error message will be passed in the header also. Now let us create our API errors object. API errors is equal to new API errors. The first parameter is local datetime.now. The second parameter should be the status code. So let me take it from the HTTP status object. HTTP status.value. The third parameter is the error object. The fourth parameter is HTTP status. And now we need to return the API errors object. We rename this variable name and I will use the same return statement here also. In case of status, it expects an object of HTTP status code. So let us use HTTP status code dot value of. And what is this code? The code again is HTTP status dot value. Let me get the code separately here. In status code equal to HTTP status dot value. Now we have got the status code. So let me pass it on HTTP status code dot value of status code. So same thing, let us do it for invalid ID exception also. Invalid, handle invalid ID, and the exception name is invalid ID exception. And in this case, let us add one other exception messages, not acceptable. Rest of the things are all same. Okay. If any other exception other than all these exception occurs, if you want to handle it, you need to create another exception handler to handle the generic exception. Just like how we do, we will be writing multiple catch statements. At last, we will add a catch which is accepting exception as parameter. So same thing we will do it over here. So in this case, it is just exception. Exception.class. Let me give it as bad request. If any other exception other than this occurs, automatically it will show me the status as bad request. Let me change the method name, handle exception. Okay, here also I need to change it to invalid ID exception. Even though you have changed in the method name, if you have not changed it over here, it will not handle that exception. It will handle only product not found exception. I think I have completed everything properly, and we have added at controller advice also. Be very careful with the import statements. Without my knowledge, I have imported somewhere the status value from a different package. All set now. So we have added the exception. Our REST API is ready. The next step is we need to deploy our application in Docker. Once our application is deployed in Docker, we can test the application using Postman. So in the next video, let us learn how to deploy our application in Docker. Till then, stay tuned. Thank you.